The world saw Graceland as Elvis Presley's American dream palace. White columns, rolling lawns, the mansion where the king lived like royalty. But behind those famous iron gates, a different reality existed. Priscilla Presley would later reveal that Graceland wasn't just a home. It was a controlled environment where Elvis dictated every detail of daily life, from what she wore to when she could sleep, from who she could see to how she applied her makeup. The rules were never written down, never explained to outsiders, and for years remained one of Hollywood's most closely guarded secrets. What Priscilla experienced inside those walls would challenge everything the world believed about Elvis Presley's fairy tale romance. Because the mansion that represented ultimate freedom for the king was, for the teenage girl who loved him, something entirely different. A beautiful prison with invisible bars, where even her reflection in the mirror wasn't truly her own. Before we continue with this untold story, please subscribe to our channel to discover more hidden truths about music legends that changed history forever. When Priscilla Presley first stepped through Graceland's iron gates in 1963, she was just 17 years old, a young woman who had spent the previous 4 years in a long-distance relationship with the most famous man on earth. They had met in Germany in 1959 when Elvis was stationed there during his army service, and Priscilla was only 14, the daughter of an Air Force officer. Their relationship had been controversial from the start, but Elvis had convinced her parents that his intentions were honorable, that he simply wanted to mentor and protect this young girl who reminded him so much of his beloved mother Gladys, who had died just a year before they met. Now, 4 years later, Priscilla was moving into Graceland permanently, ostensibly to finish her senior year of high school at Immaculate Conception Cathedral School in Memphis, but in reality to begin a new life under Elvis's complete supervision and control. What Priscilla didn't know was that the moment she crossed that threshold, she was entering a carefully controlled environment where her individual identity would slowly begin to dissolve, replaced by Elvis's vision of the perfect woman. The king of rock and roll didn't just want a girlfriend or even a wife. He wanted to create his ideal companion, sculpted and shaped according to specifications that existed only in his mind, influenced by his memories of his mother, his Hollywood leading ladies, and his own complicated relationship with femininity and control. The first rules Priscilla encountered at Graceland were about appearance, and they were non-negotiable. Elvis had very specific ideas about how a woman should look, ideas that had been forming since his early days in Hollywood, when he worked alongside glamorous actresses who spent hours in makeup chairs before appearing on screen. Within days of moving in, Elvis began dictating her appearance with the precision of a film director preparing his leading lady for a close-up. He wanted her hair styled in a specific way, a towering bouffant with dark, dramatic volume that required teasing, hairspray, and constant maintenance. He insisted on heavy eye makeup, thick black eyeliner that extended far beyond her natural eye shape, creating an almost feline appearance that made her eyes appear larger and more dramatic. He selected the shade of lipstick she should wear, preferring vibrant reds and deep pinks that stood out dramatically against her pale skin. He even had opinions about her nail polish color and the way she should style her eyebrows. But the appearance rules went far beyond makeup and hair. Elvis personally selected Priscilla's wardrobe, choosing outfits that reflected his taste rather than hers. He preferred form-fitting clothes that emphasized her figure, tight pants, fitted blouses, dresses that showed her shape but never revealed too much skin. She began to refer to herself as Elvis's living doll, a description that captured both the intensity of his focus on her appearance and the passive role she was expected to play in her own presentation. In her memoir, Priscilla would later write that she had begun to forget who I was, a statement that reflected the gradual erosion of her individual identity under the constant pressure to conform to Elvis's vision. The most disturbing aspect of these appearance rules was that they applied even when no one else was around. Elvis didn't want Priscilla to look glamorous only when they went out in public or when guests visited Graceland. He expected her to maintain this carefully constructed appearance at all times, as if she were constantly on camera, constantly performing the role of Elvis Presley's perfect woman. She couldn't walk around the house in casual clothes or without makeup. She was expected to wake up early enough to complete her full beauty routine before Elvis woke up, so that when he opened his eyes, He would see the polished, perfected version of her rather than the natural, unadorned young woman she actually was. This constant performance was exhausting, both physically and psychologically, but Priscilla understood that it was the price of being with Elvis, and she paid it willingly, at least in the beginning. Beyond the appearance rules, Graceland itself was divided into zones of access that reflected Elvis's need for control and privacy. The mansion's layout became a physical manifestation of the invisible rules that governed life inside its walls. The most famous of these restrictions was the absolute prohibition on entering the upstairs area of Graceland, a rule that applied to almost everyone except Elvis, Priscilla, and a very small circle of trusted individuals. The second floor of Graceland contained Elvis's private bedroom, his personal office, and several other rooms that he considered his sanctuary, completely off-limits to the Memphis Mafia, to visiting celebrities, to family members, and certainly to fans or journalists who might occasionally tour the public areas of the home. Elvis guarded this space jealously, treating it as the only area of Graceland where he could truly escape the demands of being Elvis Presley. For Priscilla, this upstairs area represented both privilege and prison. She had access to spaces that others were forbidden from entering, which should have felt like a mark of special status, but in reality, it often felt like isolation. While the Memphis Mafia members socialized downstairs, watching movies in Elvis's private screening room, or playing pool, or gathering in the dining room for group meals, Priscilla was often upstairs, waiting for Elvis to wake up, waiting for him to call for her, waiting for permission to join whatever was happening in the more social areas of the house. The upstairs became a gilded cage, a space that was technically more exclusive and private, but which also cut Priscilla off from the social dynamics happening elsewhere in the mansion. But the access restrictions went beyond just the upstairs area. Elvis's office was completely off-limits unless he explicitly invited someone in. Certain rooms were designated for specific purposes and couldn't be used for anything else without Elvis's permission. The dining room operated on Elvis's schedule, which meant that meals happened when he wanted them, not according to any conventional breakfast, lunch, dinner timeline. The jungle room, with its Polynesian-themed decor and exotic carved furniture, was Elvis's creative space where he sometimes recorded music, and entering it without invitation was understood to be a violation of his privacy. Graceland wasn't just a house, it was a carefully controlled environment where every space had meaning, where every boundary was enforced not through locked doors or security guards, but through the understood consequences of violating Elvis's unspoken rules. Perhaps the most disorienting rule for Priscilla was the complete restructuring of normal time that life at Graceland required. Elvis was profoundly nocturnal, a habit that had developed during his early touring years and intensified during his Hollywood period when late-night recording sessions and all-night parties became the norm. By the time Priscilla moved into Graceland, Elvis typically slept during the day and was most active at night, and everyone in the mansion was expected to adapt to his schedule regardless of their own natural rhythms or external obligations. This meant that morning might begin at 4 in the afternoon when Elvis finally woke up, and evening activities might extend until dawn. Dinner could be served at midnight, breakfast at sunset, and the traditional structure of a day simply didn't exist inside Graceland's walls. For Priscilla, adapting to Elvis' time meant abandoning any sense of normal routine. She was expected to be available whenever Elvis was awake and wanted her company, which might mean sitting with him while he watched movies until 5 in the morning, or accompanying him on spontaneous late-night trips to the local fairground that Elvis would rent out for private use after it closed to the public. Sleep became something she grabbed in irregular intervals rather than a consistent nightly practice. Her body's natural circadian rhythms were completely disrupted, leaving her in a constant state of mild disorientation that made it even harder to maintain a clear sense of self or to push back against the increasingly restrictive rules that governed her existence. As the months turned into years, Priscilla began to realize that the rules governing her appearance and her schedule were accompanied by equally strict but less visible rules about her social life and her connection to the world beyond Graceland's gates. Elvis was intensely protective of Priscilla, but his protection often functioned as isolation. He didn't want her developing close friendships with other women who might influence her thinking or encourage her independence. He was suspicious of any men who showed interest in befriending her, seeing potential romantic rivals in even the most innocent social interactions. He preferred that she socialize primarily with the wives and girlfriends of the Memphis Mafia members, women who were already integrated into Elvis's world and understood the unspoken rules that governed it. Any friendship outside this approved circle required Elvis's tacit permission, and even approved friendships were monitored and subject to sudden withdrawal of approval if Elvis decided they were becoming too close or too influential. Priscilla's schooling at Immaculate Conception Cathedral School provided some temporary escape from Graceland's isolation, but even this was carefully controlled. Elvis arranged for a member of his security team to drive her to school and pick her up, ensuring that she had no unsupervised time before or after classes. She was discouraged from participating in after-school activities that would extend her time away from Graceland. The normal teenage experiences of hanging out with friends after school, going to parties on weekends, or developing crushes on boys her own age were completely unavailable to her. The isolation intensified after Priscilla graduated from high school. With school no longer providing even minimal contact with the outside world, she became almost completely confined to Graceland and its immediate social ecosystem. Her days were spent waiting for Elvis to wake up. Her evenings were spent attending to his needs and participating in whatever activities he had planned, and her nights were spent accommodating his nocturnal schedule. She had no job, no independent income, no reason to leave Graceland except when Elvis decided they should go out together. She was financially dependent on Elvis, socially dependent on his approval, and emotionally dependent on the relationship itself, which had become the entire center of her existence. In her memoir, Priscilla would describe this period as feeling like she was in prison, but a prison that was so beautiful and so comfortable that she struggled to articulate her unhappiness even to herself. Perhaps the most controversial aspect of Graceland's hidden rules involved intimacy and sexuality. Elvis had very particular ideas about sex and relationships, ideas shaped by his close relationship with his mother, his Catholic upbringing, and his own complicated psychology around women and purity. He told Priscilla early in their relationship that he wanted to wait until marriage before they fully consummated their relationship, a decision that Priscilla initially interpreted as respect for her youth and a sign of his honorable intentions. But as time went on, she began to understand that this restriction was less about protecting her and more about Elvis's own psychological needs and his desire to maintain control over their relationship's progression. He wanted Priscilla to remain in a state of suspended innocence, frozen at the moment when he first met her in Germany, young, pure, untouched by the complications of adult sexuality. Elvis maintained firm boundaries around what was and wasn't allowed, boundaries that he controlled and that Priscilla was expected to respect without question. He would initiate physical contact when he wanted it and withdraw when he didn't, leaving Priscilla in a constant state of uncertainty about what was acceptable and what would result in his disapproval or rejection. This dynamic gave Elvis complete power over the intimate aspects of their relationship, turning something that should have been mutual and negotiated into another area where his preferences were absolute and her desires were secondary. One of the most remarkable aspects of these rules was that they operated largely invisible even to the people who lived at Graceland and spent every day with Elvis and Priscilla. The Memphis Mafia, the group of male friends who served as Elvis's companions, employees, and entourage, saw Priscilla daily, observed her interactions with Elvis, and were present for many private moments in the mansion. Yet most of them failed to recognize the extent of Elvis's control over her life. They saw a young woman who seemed devoted to Elvis, who appeared happy to be with him, who participated willingly in the unusual lifestyle that Graceland demanded. They didn't see the invisible rules that governed her every movement, the psychological pressure that shaped her decisions, the gradual erosion of her independent identity that was happening behind closed doors. There were several reasons for this collective blind spot. First, the Memphis Mafia members were themselves subject to Elvis's control, though in different ways. They were employees as much as friends, dependent on Elvis for their income and their lifestyle, and they had learned not to question his decisions or challenge his authority. Second, the social norms of the 1960s made Elvis's behavior seem less unusual than it would appear today. Many men in that era exercised significant control over their wives and girlfriends, making decisions about their appearance, their social lives, and their daily activities. Some Memphis Mafia members did sense that something was wrong. Red West, who had been with Elvis since high school, later admitted in interviews that he thought Priscilla seemed isolated and controlled, but didn't fully understand the extent of it until after she left Elvis and began speaking publicly about her experiences. Sonny West noticed that Priscilla rarely expressed her own opinions and seemed to defer to Elvis on every decision, but he interpreted this as devotion rather than control. The signs were there, but the Memphis Mafia members either didn't recognize them or chose not to investigate further, maintaining the comfortable fiction that life at Graceland was as glamorous and desirable as it appeared from the outside. There came a moment when Priscilla looked in the mirror and experienced a profound disconnection from her own reflection. The face staring back at her was beautiful by conventional standards, perfectly made up, framed by carefully styled hair, presenting an image that would photograph well and meet Elvis's exacting specifications. But it wasn't her face, not really. It was the face Elvis had designed, the appearance he preferred, the visual representation of his ideal woman. The girl who had arrived at Graceland at 17 with her own sense of style had been gradually replaced by this carefully constructed image, and Priscilla suddenly realized she couldn't remember what she actually liked, what she would choose if the choice were truly hers. This moment of recognition, or rather of failing to recognize herself, became a turning point in Priscilla's relationship with both Elvis and with Graceland. She began to understand that the rules she had been following weren't just about maintaining Elvis's standards or fitting into his lifestyle. They were about control, about one person's vision overwhelming another person's identity, about a relationship structure that required her to become smaller and less distinct so that Elvis could remain larger than life. But recognizing the problem didn't immediately solve it. Priscilla was trapped not just by Elvis's rules but by her own emotional investment in the relationship, by her financial dependence, by the years she had already invested, and by her genuine love for the man behind the control. She couldn't simply walk away. She had nowhere to go, no independent means of support, no career or education that would allow her to start over, and no clear sense of who she was outside of being Elvis's partner. During the following years, Priscilla began small acts of quiet rebellion, insisting on certain friendships despite Elvis's disapproval, occasionally choosing an outfit he hadn't selected, expressing opinions that differed from his, taking karate classes that gave her a sense of physical autonomy and strength. These were tiny steps toward reclaiming her identity, the first movements away from complete submission to Graceland's invisible rules. The rules that governed Graceland didn't end when Elvis and Priscilla married in 1967 at the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas. If anything, marriage intensified some aspects of the control while creating new complications. Priscilla was now Elvis Presley's wife, a role that came with public expectations and responsibilities that added new layers to the already complex system of rules she navigated daily. Then, a year after their wedding, she became pregnant with their daughter Lisa Marie, adding the role of mother to the already overwhelming demands of being Elvis's wife. The birth of Lisa Marie in February 1968 created a new dynamic in the household. Priscilla now had someone else to focus on besides Elvis, someone who needed her and depended on her in ways that had nothing to do with Elvis's preferences or Graceland's rules. Motherhood gave Priscilla a sense of purpose and identity that was separate from her role as Elvis's wife, and it also gave her a reason to start questioning some of the rules that governed their life. She wanted Lisa Marie to have experiences she herself had been denied: normal friendships with other children, regular schedules that supported healthy development, the freedom to explore and develop her own personality without constant surveillance and control. By 1972, Priscilla had reached the decision point. She could continue living within Graceland's rules, accepting the control and the isolation in exchange for the security and status of being Elvis Presley's wife, or she could leave and face the enormous uncertainty of building an independent life. The choice was complicated by her genuine love for Elvis, by her concern for what divorce might do to him given his deteriorating physical and mental state, by the practical challenges of leaving such a high-profile marriage, and by the fear that she might not survive economically or emotionally outside the protected environment of Graceland. But ultimately, The need for autonomy and the desire to model independence for her daughter won out. In early 1972, Priscilla told Elvis she was leaving, and by the end of that year they had separated. Their divorce was finalized in October 1973, ending a relationship that had spanned 14 years and fundamentally shaped both of their lives. For years after leaving Elvis, Priscilla remained relatively quiet about the specific dynamics of their relationship and the rules that had governed life at Graceland. This changed in 1985, when Priscilla published her memoir, Elvis and Me, a book that finally revealed the full extent of the hidden rules and the psychological impact they had on her. The book was shocking to many fans who had idealized the Elvis-Priscilla relationship as a fairy tale romance. They struggled to reconcile the image of Elvis as the king, generous, talented, beloved by millions, with the portrait Priscilla painted of a controlling man who had systematically shaped her identity to match his preferences and isolated her from the world beyond his control. The response was mixed and complicated. Some fans refused to believe her account, dismissing it as an embittered ex-wife trying to profit from Elvis's name. Others defended Elvis's behavior as typical of the era, arguing that many men exercised similar control over their wives in the 1960s and early 1970s. Still others, particularly women who had experienced controlling relationships themselves, recognized the patterns Priscilla described and appreciated her courage in speaking publicly about dynamics that were often hidden and denied. What made Priscilla's account particularly powerful was her refusal to portray herself simply as a victim, or Elvis simply as a villain. She acknowledged that Elvis had genuine love for her, and that he struggled with his own psychological wounds and traumas, including the death of his mother and the pressures of extraordinary fame. She recognized that the control he exercised came partly from a desire to protect her and preserve something pure in his life that the chaos of stardom couldn't corrupt. She admitted that she had participated willingly in the relationship for many years, that she had loved him deeply, and that the experience had shaped her in ways that were both damaging and ultimately strengthening. This nuanced perspective made her account more credible and more troubling. It wasn't a simple story of abuse and escape, but rather a complex portrait of how two people can genuinely love each other while trapped in dynamics that are fundamentally unhealthy. Today, Graceland remains one of America's most visited private homes, a museum and monument to Elvis Presley's extraordinary career and cultural impact. Thousands of fans tour the mansion every week, walking through the rooms where Elvis lived, seeing the gold records and stage costumes and personal artifacts that document his journey from poverty in Tupelo to global superstardom. But the tour doesn't include the upstairs area where Priscilla spent so many hours waiting for Elvis to wake up, and it doesn't explain the invisible rules that governed daily life in the mansion. The Graceland that visitors see is the public version, the symbol of success and the American dream. The Graceland that Priscilla revealed in her memoir was something else entirely. A beautiful cage where one man's vision of perfection required another person's submission, where love existed alongside control, and where the price of proximity to fame was the slow dissolution of independent identity. Priscilla's story helped people understand that controlling behavior doesn't always look like physical violence or obvious abuse. It can be subtle, wrapped in love and concern, manifesting as preferences and suggestions that gradually become requirements and expectations. The rules Elvis established at Graceland seemed individually like reasonable preferences, but collectively, and in the context of the enormous power imbalance between them, these preferences created a system of control that fundamentally limited Priscilla's freedom and identity. The rules that governed Priscilla's life at Graceland were hidden for decades, known only to those inside the mansion's walls. When Priscilla finally revealed these rules to the world, she did more than expose the private dynamics of one famous relationship. She illuminated patterns of control that existed throughout society, but remained invisible because they were normalized, or simply never discussed. The legacy of Elvis Presley includes not just his music and his cultural impact, but also this more difficult story about control, identity, and the price that one young woman paid for loving the king of rock and roll.